I keep a ledger. Not the kind my employer, Mr. Harlan Greer, keeps for cattle counts and winter feed estimates. Mine is smaller, a brown leather book barely big enough to fit in my breast pocket, filled with the kind of notes a man writes when he can't make sense of the world and needs to put it somewhere. Dates, weather patterns, small observations, things I see on the range that don't fit neatly into any category I was taught to recognize. I've filled 11 of these books since I was 19 years old. On the 14th of October, 1883, I wrote the following entry. The Apache man with the braid is building something on the ridge again, 3 days in a row now. Can't tell what it is yet. Greer says ignore him. Henderson says he's touched in the head. I say nothing, but I keep watching. His name, I would later learn, was Sakwa. He was perhaps 60 years old, though age sat differently on him than it did on the white men I'd grown up around. He wasn't stooped. He wasn't slow. He moved with the deliberate, unhurried certainty of a man who had long since stopped being in a hurry to prove himself to anyone. He lived with a small group. His son Daco, a daughter-in-law whose name I struggled to pronounce correctly for weeks, 3 grandchildren, and 2 elder women who seemed to run the camp with quiet efficiency that put most military operations I'd seen to shame. They'd been permitted by the territorial arrangement to occupy a stretch of land on the eastern edge of Greer's grazing property, a rocky slope with good southern exposure, and a creek that didn't fully freeze until deep winter. Sakwa had been building something for 11 days when the laughter started. I wasn't there for the first round of it. Henderson told me about it that evening over supper at the bunkhouse, a long, wandering story punctuated by his own wheezing chuckle. Old Indian up on the ridge is weaving sticks together, Henderson said, stabbing at his beans. Like a bird, like an actual bird building a nest. Boy, I've seen a lot of things in 30 years on the range, but I never saw a grown man spend his days braiding branches like some kind of. What kind of branches? I asked. Henderson stopped chewing and looked at me like I'd said something in a foreign language. What? What kind of branches is he using? A long pause. Does it matter? I wrote it down that night. Does it matter? I wrote it at the top of the page and underlined it twice, because in my experience, that question is almost always asked by someone who has already decided the answer is no, and is usually wrong. By the following week, Sakwa's construction had become something of a local entertainment. 2 of Greer's hands would ride up to the eastern fence after morning work, lean on the posts, and watch from a distance with the studied amusement of men who have nothing better to do. They weren't cruel exactly. They just didn't understand what they were seeing, and in my experience, men who don't understand something will almost always reach for mockery before they reach for curiosity. It's faster. It requires less. I went up there myself on a Wednesday morning, under the pretense of checking the fence line. What I saw stopped me. Sakwa was working with willow branches, long, flexible ones, still pale and supple, not yet dried to brittleness. He was weaving them into a lattice that formed the base layer of a roofing structure over the main living area of his camp's central dwelling. But it wasn't just the weaving that held my attention. It was the layers. Beneath the willow, he'd already placed a thick bed of dried grass not scattered, but arranged in a deliberate shingled pattern, thick end out, the way roof thatchers in the old country had apparently worked, though I only knew that from a book. Over the grass, the willow lattice would compress it, hold it against the wind. I could already see how a second layer would follow, then a third. The structure wasn't a nest. It was a system. I stood at that fence for perhaps 20 minutes without saying anything. Sakwa didn't acknowledge me, or rather, he acknowledged me precisely as much as he acknowledged the hawk circling overhead, which is to say, he was aware of me, and he continued working. His son Daco was beside him, receiving instructions in Apache and executing them with quick, practiced efficiency. The boy, he was perhaps 18, moved like someone who had been learning this his whole life, and was only now being trusted with the harder parts. I thought about writing something in my ledger, then decided the words weren't ready yet. The laughter peaked on a Saturday. Greer himself rode out that afternoon, a rare event, since Greer generally considered the eastern ridge beneath his attention, and stood at the fence with 3 of his men and Mr. Carl Waverly from the town, who was visiting about a cattle contract. I happened to be nearby, replacing a rotted fence post, close enough to hear. "What in the Lord's name is that?" Waverly said, not even making it a question. "The old Apache's been at it for 2 weeks," Greer said. There was a kind of fond contempt in his voice that I found more grating than outright hostility. "Building some kind of, I don't know, brush hut." "Is that woven?" Waverly leaned forward, squinting. "Is he weaving his roof?" "Appears so." A long beat of silence, and then Waverly laughed. Not a mean laugh, but the easy, reflexive laugh of a man who has never needed to build his own shelter, and therefore couldn't imagine why anyone would spend this much effort on something that looked, to his eye, like nothing more than an elaborate pile of sticks. "Well," Waverly said, wiping at the corner of his eye, "good luck to him when November hits." Greer said nothing, but the corner of his mouth moved. I replaced my fence post. I did not look up. That evening, I wrote in my ledger. Waverly laughed. Greer smiled. Henderson agrees with both of them. I keep thinking about the layers, about the way the grass was shingled, about the fact that Sakwa has survived on this land for 60 years, and Waverly has survived in a drafty timber office in town, and nobody in that fence line group seems to see any difference between their qualifications to judge a roof. I paused, then added, "I don't know what I'm watching, but I know I'm not done watching it." The first week of November arrived gray and threatening. I'd lived through hard winters on the range, the kind where the water in your boot tray freezes overnight, where horses develop that specific look of deep misery around their eyes, where the wind comes across the flat land with nothing to stop it and hits you in the chest like a thrown stone. I knew what was coming. But the older hands were saying something different about this winter. They were saying it in the way old range men say things, not with alarm, but with a particular quiet that was somehow more unsettling than alarm. The kind of quiet that means I've seen this before and I did not enjoy it. "Ground's already hardening wrong," said old Mose, our most senior hand, prodding the earth outside the bunkhouse with the toe of his boot. "Hardening fast, too fast, like the cold's in a hurry." He wasn't wrong. By the second week of November, we'd had 2 light snowfalls that didn't melt between them. They just layered, the first becoming the floor for the second. I rode out to check the eastern fence on the 12th. Sakwa's roof was finished. Standing back from the dwelling, you could see it properly for the first time, a gently rounded surface of interlocked branches, dried grass pressed tight beneath them, the whole thing sealed along the ridge with what appeared to be a packed clay mixture. The shape of it was not like anything I'd seen built by white hands. It wasn't peaked the way a barn roof peaks. It curved. It breathed, if that makes any sense. There were calculated gaps that I would later understand were for ventilation, positioned in a way that kept wind from driving straight through them. Daco was outside splitting wood. He noticed me and gave a nod. I raised my hand in return. I wanted to ask questions. I had 11 of them already written in my ledger, with blank lines left for answers. But I didn't know the language, and the gap between wanting to understand something and knowing how to ask about it is sometimes wider than the Rio Grande. I rode back to the ranch house. I wrote, "Roof is done. It's better than I thought it would be. I think I need to revise what I thought I knew about what I was looking at." The snow that arrived on the 21st of November was not a snowfall. It was an event. I was inside the bunkhouse when it began, and for the first hour I didn't take it seriously. Snow was snow, and we were prepared. By the second hour, old Mose had gone quiet in a way that made the back of my neck tighten. By the third hour, we couldn't see the fence line from the window. By morning, we couldn't open the bunkhouse door. Henderson and I took turns pushing until the packed snow gave way, and we stepped out into a world that had been completely remade overnight. The drifts against the north wall of the bunkhouse were chest high. The water trough was buried. One of the young horses was in genuine distress, and two of the older ones had crowded together in the far corner of the enclosed pen, with the practiced resignation of animals that had been through something like this before. Greer's main house held, the barn held. The equipment shed did not. The eastern-facing wall buckled sometime in the early morning hours under the weight of accumulated snow on the roof. A standard pitch-plank construction that had served fine for 7 years, and failed this particular night because the snow came too fast, piled too heavy, and the angle wasn't steep enough to shed it. We spent the first day digging out. The second day was colder than the first. The temperature dropped in a way that felt almost personal, like the winter was committing to something. Greer rode out on the third morning to assess damage, and Henderson and I went with him. When we reached the eastern ridge, I felt something loosen in my chest that I hadn't realized had been clenched. Sakwa's roof was standing. Not just standing, unchanged. The snow had accumulated on its curved surface, and because of the shape and the density of the weave, had partially shed itself in the night, the accumulated mass sliding off in slow sheets rather than compressing into a destructive weight. Where our shed wall had buckled inward, Sakwa's roof had simply done what it was designed to do. Greer reined in his horse and sat looking at it for a long time. He didn't say anything. I wrote in my ledger that night, "The roof held. I am not surprised." I think I stopped being surprised somewhere around the third week of October when I first saw the way he shingled the grass. The rest of them are surprised. I don't know what to do with that. What the cold teaches, if you're willing to be taught. The fourth day of the blizzard was the one that broke people. Not physically, though that was coming too, in its own way, but something in the spirit of the ranch cracked a little under the weight of continuous cold, and the specific misery of being trapped and behind and unable to do anything useful. The cattle had been partially consolidated before the storm, thank God, but we'd lost access to the north pasture completely, and there were 30 head somewhere out there that we couldn't reach. Greer was not a man who showed fear, but he showed something adjacent to it on that fourth morning, a thinness around his eyes, a clipped quality to his words that I'd learned to recognize as the outer edge of his composure. "Henderson, Mose, take the 2 Belgians and try the north access road," he said at breakfast. "Thomas, that's me, you're on water duty, every trough on the property." Water duty meant breaking ice. An axe, a bar, your own body heat, and the specific misery of wet gloves in 20 below temperatures. I didn't complain. Complaining in that kind of cold is like shouting at a mountain. The mountain doesn't hear you, and the effort just makes you colder. I was working my way east along the fence line, trough by trough, when I heard it. A sound I couldn't immediately place. I stopped, tilted my head. The wind had dropped for a moment, those brief, strange pauses that sometimes happen in the middle of a sustained blow, like the storm pausing to catch its breath, and in that pause I heard, tapping, rhythmic, patient. I followed it to the edge of the ridge. Daco was at the creek cutting access through ice to get water. He was using a technique I hadn't seen, a long-handled tool, heavier at the end than I'd expect, and he was working in a pattern rather than just attacking the ice directly. 3 blows in a triangle, then removing the loosened chunk, then 3 more. It was faster than what I'd been doing, considerably faster. He looked up and saw me watching. I held up my axe by way of explanation. He glanced at it, then at the trough beside me, then back at his tool. He said something I didn't understand, then demonstrated the triangle pattern on a section of ice near me. I watched. I tried it. It worked. We didn't speak, couldn't. Not really, not in any language the other fully understood. But for the next 40 minutes we worked side by side on adjacent sections of creek access and trough clearing, and it was the most useful 40 minutes I'd spent in 4 days. When we finished, Daco gave a short nod and went back toward the camp. I stood there for a moment in the cold with my axe, feeling something I couldn't immediately name. I wrote it down that evening. He didn't ask if I wanted to be shown. He just showed me. There was no performance in it, no condescension. Just here is how the thing is done more efficiently. Take it or leave it. I took it. By the 5th day, the north pasture was still unreachable, and Greer had made his peace with probably losing some cattle. That peace was thin and grim, and nobody mentioned it out loud. What nobody expected was the second complication. Old Mose had a cough that had been unremarkable for 2 weeks, the kind of cough every ranch hand gets when the air turns cold and dry, and the dust of the bunkhouse mixes with wood smoke. But on the 5th morning it changed. Mose came to breakfast bent slightly forward, and the cough had a wet, deep quality to it that made the hair on my arm stand up. Greer sent a rider for the doctor in town. The rider came back 3 hours later, unable to get through. The road was drifted closed to within 2 miles of town, and the doctor himself had 3 other cases he couldn't leave. Mose got worse through the afternoon. He wasn't in crisis yet, but the trajectory was clear, and we all knew it, and nobody talked about it directly because talking about it directly would have made it more real than any of us wanted it to be. I was sitting with him in the early evening, just sitting, because there wasn't much else to do, when I heard footsteps on the bunkhouse porch. It was the elder woman from Sakwa's camp, the one whose name I'd struggled to pronounce, Nolly. I'd finally learned, though I was never confident I was saying it right. She had a clay pot wrapped in layered cloth. She set it on the edge of Mose's bunk without being invited to, without any preamble at all, and peeled back the cloth to show a tea, dark, smelling of pine, and something else I couldn't identify. She said something to me. Then, when I didn't understand, she mimed drinking it, then pointed at Mose's chest. I looked at the pot, I looked at Mose. "What's in it?" he asked, his voice rough. "I don't know," I said. A pause, then, "Well, can't get much worse, can it?" He drank it. Nolly sat beside the bunk for a while, not hovering, not performing concern, just present in the way that certain people know how to be without making it about themselves. After a time she left, quietly, with the empty pot. I wrote, "I don't know what was in it." I know that by morning, Mose was breathing easier. I know that I have been trained my whole life to call this a coincidence when it comes from a source I don't fully understand, and to call it medicine when it comes from a source I trust. I'm writing this down so I remember to notice the difference. The 7th day. The storm had eased to a hard, sustained cold rather than active blizzard conditions, which meant we could move again, which meant we finally reached the north pasture. We found 23 of the 30 head alive, clustered in a gully that had provided some shelter. 7 were gone, frozen or lost, we couldn't determine which. Greer looked at the 7 empty spaces in his count and didn't say anything for a very long time. On the way back, we passed the eastern ridge. Sakwa was outside. He was doing something that took me a moment to understand. He was walking the perimeter of his camp in a slow, deliberate circle, examining each structure, testing connections, adjusting things that had shifted under the storm's pressure. There was nothing dramatic about it. He wasn't showing anyone anything, wasn't performing inspection. He was just doing what a careful man does after a hard thing has passed, checking what held, noting what needed attention, giving credit to nothing and planning for everything. Greer watched him for a moment. Then, unexpectedly, he called out across the ridge, "Your roof held." It was a strange thing to say. Not an apology. Greer wasn't built for apologies. Not quite a compliment either. just an observation delivered in a voice that carried something in it I hadn't often heard from Harlan Greer, a kind of blunt, reluctant recognition. Sakwa turned and looked at him, then looked at the roof, then looked back at Greer. He said something in Apache that none of us understood. Then he went back to his circuit. Henderson looked at Greer. Greer looked at no one in particular. I wrote it all down in my head, saving it for the ledger. That evening, I finally found a way to ask a question I'd been carrying for weeks. Daco's English was fragmentary but present. He'd picked it up through trading contacts, and from a brief period at a missionary school that he'd apparently departed under circumstances. He communicated through a brief, expressive grimace that told me everything I needed to know without a single word. We were at the creek again, and I pointed at the roof visible on the ridge above us, and I held up my hands in a gesture that I hoped communicated how did he know. Daco considered this for a while. Then he said carefully, his father, his grandfather, their grandfathers. He paused, forming the next part. The cold comes, it always comes. The question is not, he stopped, searching for the word, not if. The question is how to still be standing. He looked up at the ridge, at the silhouette of the dwelling. My grandfather built for a winter he knew was coming, not from papers. He touched his temple, from water, from birds, from how the dogs slept. He read what was there. I thought about Greer's equipment shed with its buckled wall. I thought about the architectural specifications that shed had been built to. The standard pitch, the standard plank thickness, the standards devised by people in offices who had studied other people's buildings, rather than the specific and particular and unignorable evidence of the land itself. He knew this winter was different, I said, before it came. Daco looked at me with an expression that was almost, but not quite, patience. He always knew, he said. Every winter could be the bad one, so every roof is built for the bad one. I stood there with that for a moment. Then I pulled out my ledger and wrote it down, right there at the creek in the cold, with fingers that were going numb. The night of the 8th day was the quietest the storm had been. I walked out after supper. I do this sometimes, just walk the property in the dark, partly to think and partly because the bunkhouse gets to feeling very small in hard weather. The sky had cleared for the first time in over a week, and the stars were violent and closed the way they only get in deep cold, like the sky is showing off because it knows you're miserable. I walked east, more by habit than intention, until I was looking up at the ridge. There was firelight in Sakwa's camp. The faint sound of a voice, just one, low and steady, and I realized after a moment it was him, speaking to someone, or perhaps to no one, in the way some people speak when they're recounting something that happened to them a long time ago and need to say it out loud to make sure they haven't forgotten it. I didn't go closer, that wasn't my right. But I stood there for a while in the dark and the cold, listening to the sound of a voice I couldn't understand, in a language I hadn't learned, describing something I would never know, coming from behind a roof I had once thought was foolish, in a camp that had come through the deadliest week in recent memory with not a single wall buckled or a single life lost. I opened my ledger. By starlight, barely able to see, I wrote the date in a single line. I've been filling these books for 9 years, and I'm not sure I've ever written anything that mattered as much as watching a roof do what it was built to do. The ledger's last entry on that winter. Spring does not arrive like people who have never ranched imagine it does. It doesn't come in on a bright morning with birdsong and warming breezes. It comes in like a fighter who's taken a bad beating, slowly, unevenly, still flinching. There are days in February that feel like October. There are March mornings when the ground is frozen solid at dawn and mud by noon. Spring is a process of negotiation, not an arrival, and anyone who's tried to run a working property through the transition knows that the end of a hard winter can be almost as punishing as the winter itself. But I'm getting ahead of myself. There were still 2 more weeks of hard cold after the 8th day, and in those 2 weeks several things happened that I want to put down accurately, because memory has a way of smoothing the rough parts if you let it, and the rough parts are where the truth usually lives. The first thing was Henderson. Henderson had been the loudest of the laughers in October, not cruel, as I said, but consistent, in the way some men are consistent about skepticism because it costs them less than curiosity. He'd made the nest joke. He'd agreed with Waverley. He'd brought it up at supper more than once, with that same wheezing chuckle. After the storm, he didn't bring it up at all. But I watched him, because watching people is what I do, and what I noticed was this. In the second week after the Maine blizzard, when we were doing repair work on the shed's buckled wall, Henderson kept stopping and looking up at the eastern ridge. Just glancing. The way you glance at something you're trying to figure out without appearing to be figuring it out. On a Thursday afternoon, I was working near him and he said, without preamble, "How does it shed the snow like that?" I looked up. He was still staring at the ridge. "The roof," he clarified unnecessarily. "The curve," I said, "and the weight distribution across the lattice. The snow can't accumulate the same way it does on a flat pitch." He was quiet for a moment. "How do you know that?" I watched. Another pause, then, "Huh." He went back to work. He didn't bring it up again. But that "huh" sat with me for days, the sound of a man revising something he thought was settled, in the smallest and most private way possible, in the only privacy he could manage, which was the privacy of seeming to be busy with something else. "I wrote," Henderson said, "huh" today. I think that might be the closest I've ever seen him come to changing his mind. The second thing was harder. On the 14th day after the blizzard's peak, one of Sakwa's grandchildren, the youngest, a girl of perhaps 4, became ill. I didn't know this for 2 days. When I found out, I learned it secondhand from Daco, who came to the ranch house not asking for help exactly, but indicating that the child needed something they didn't have access to: warm milk, specifically, and a particular kind of dried herb that I understood from his gestures might help with breathing, something our supplies had and his did not at that moment. Greer gave the milk without being asked twice. Mrs. Greer, who I'd barely spoken to in 3 years of employment, appeared from the main house with a small wrapped bundle of dried herbs and a wool blanket that she pressed into Daco's hands with a focused, direct efficiency that surprised me. The girl recovered over the following 3 days. I'm not drawing a lesson from that, not out loud anyway. Greer was not transformed by the gesture. Mrs. Greer went back to the main house and remained as distant as before. Daco thanked them in the formal, careful way you thank someone when you're not certain of the territory and can't afford to be wrong about it. But I write it down because it happened, and because transactions like that, small, human, conducted in the margins of larger conflicts and histories, have a tendency to get left out of the record, and the record is worse for their absence. Sakwa came to the ranch house once. Only once during that entire winter. In the last week of January, when the cold had softened just slightly, not enough to celebrate, but enough to breathe again. He came alone. He stood at the door, which I was near at the time, and waited until Greer appeared. He had something in his hands, a piece of the woven lattice from his roof construction, a sample, cut deliberately. You could see it was meant to be handled, the edges trimmed clean. He held it out to Greer and said something in Apache. Greer looked at the piece of lattice. He looked at Sakwa. He looked at me for some reason, I think because I was the only one nearby, and people look at the nearest person when they don't know what to do with their hands. I didn't know what Sakwa had said, but I knew what the gesture meant. I think Greer did too, because something moved across his face, not discomfort, not exactly. Something more like the expression a man makes when he's been given something he doesn't know how to receive. He took the lattice. He said stiffly, "Thank you." Sakwa nodded once, Then he turned and walked back up the ridge. Greer stood in the doorway holding the piece of woven branches for a long moment. Then he put it on the shelf beside the door, the shelf where he kept small items, nothing important, things that had no particular home but that he didn't want to throw away. It was still there when I left that property, a year later. I want to write about the roof one more time, because I think I didn't quite get it right in the earlier entries, not factually, but in the way that matters. In March, when the snowmelt began, I went up to the ridge alone one afternoon and just looked at Sakwa's dwelling for a while. The roof had been through the worst winter in anyone's recent memory. It had shed snow, resisted wind, held its structure against temperatures that had killed livestock and collapsed outbuildings, and done all of this while providing genuine warmth and ventilation to the people inside. From a distance it still looked, if you didn't know what you were looking at, like something rudimentary, like something a person might construct out of desperation, with whatever was to hand, before they had the resources to build something real. I'd thought that too once, briefly. Before I'd stopped to actually look at the layers, at the engineering within something that didn't look like engineering, because it didn't look like anything I'd learned to call engineering. There's a particular kind of ignorance that I've come to think is the most dangerous kind, and it's not the ignorance that knows it's ignorant. That kind is uncomfortable but correctable. The dangerous kind is the ignorance that has dressed itself up as knowledge. That has learned the names of a few things and decided that anything without a name it recognizes must be lesser, must be primitive, must be the kind of thing you laugh at from a fence post while the man building it just keeps building. Sakwa had 60 years of knowledge I didn't have. His father had 60 more. His grandfather 60 more than that. The roof wasn't built out of what was available. It was built out of accumulated, precise, hard-won understanding of this specific land, this specific climate, these specific materials, and the specific ways in which all of those things interact under pressure. I had mistaken unfamiliarity for inadequacy. That's the entry I should have written in October, if I'd been paying close enough attention. I wrote it in March instead, on the last page of my 11th ledger. I saw Sakwa once more before I left the Greer property that spring. I was riding the eastern fence line, habit mostly, the route I'd ridden so many times that the horse knew it by heart, and he was sitting outside his camp in the morning sun, doing something with thin strips of willow. Not building, just working with his hands, the way some people need to work with their hands when they're thinking. I reined in. He looked up. We looked at each other for a moment in the specific way of two people who have shared a winter and a fence line and a great deal of unspoken observation, and have arrived at something that isn't quite friendship, both of us knowing it, neither of us quite having the language for what it is instead. He said something I didn't understand. Then he went back to his willow strips. I rode on. At the edge of the ridge, where the fence turned north, I stopped and pulled out my ledger. I wrote the date. Then I wrote, he said something I'll never know the meaning of. I've decided that's all right. Some things aren't meant to be recorded, only witnessed. Then I closed the book. I said I would cut sentences at the end, and I will. I said the ending should be ambiguous, and it is. What I'll tell you is this. I kept filling ledgers after that winter. I filled 3 more before I left range work entirely, and in all of them in the margin of the first page, I wrote a question, not a note, not an observation, but a question, the same one every time, to remind me what kind of attention I was supposed to be paying. What are you looking at that you haven't looked at yet? That winter taught me the question. Sakwa didn't teach me the question, he'd already answered it long before I arrived. He built the answer in layers of willow and grass and accumulated knowledge, and he built it quietly, and he built it well, and he did not look up from his work when the men at the fence laughed. He knew what was coming. He'd always known.